studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. How the march in Selma sparked the passage of the Voting Rights Act 50 years ago. We'll speak with movement photographer Boyd Lewis and longtime civil rights activist and author Kevin Alexander Gray. And part of our ongoing series on the politics of parenting, we'll speak with Rebecca Haynes about her book, The Princess Problem, Guiding Our Girls Through the Princess-Obsessed Years. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
Well, President Obama announced this week that the Latin American nation of Venezuela presents, quote, an extraordinary threat to the United States. The order singles out 7 individuals who are part of Venezuela's law enforcement and military elite and freezes any U.S. assets they may own. Among them are the prosecutor who in February ordered the arrest of right-wing politician and mayor of Caracas, Antonio Ledesma. In response, the Venezuelan government of Nicolas Maduro ordered its highest-ranking diplomat to the U.S. back home. Mr. Maduro denounced the U.S. moves in a televised address earlier today and vowed to, quote, fight imperialism. He had earlier issued travel restrictions on U.S. visitors. The White House is claiming it is simply responding to human rights violations in Venezuela. Bob, how do you respond to this innocent-sounding reaction by the Obama administration that this is just about human rights?
Well, this is a little strange because on other similar issues, Obama has stepped back from some of the insanity of past U.S. foreign policy, most notably, of course, Cuba. Why the continued obsession with Venezuela, I'm not exactly sure, but the idea that Venezuela poses a threat to the U.S. national security is laughable. There are problems in Venezuela, and the United States, if it took a different posture, might be able to help. The drop in oil prices has exacerbated many of those problems. But the United States, in its constantly hostile position to Venezuela, is both making itself a laughingstock and, of course, not adding to progress in that country.
And U.S. relations with Iran have also cooled just at a moment when they seem to be thawing. And we have Tea Party Republicans to thank for it. In the wake of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's controversial address to the U.S. Congress, warning against a U.S.-Iran anti-nuclear agreement, 47 Republican members of Congress have signed on to a letter. The letter, led by Tea Party-affiliated Tom Cotton, was addressed directly to Iran's leadership and made it clear that any agreement with Iran signed by the Obama administration could be overturned by a future president. The White House is predictably furious, prompting Vice President Joe Biden to ask, what does he, Tom Cotton, know about foreign policy? Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif also responded, saying the letter was an indication that the U.S. was, quote, not trustworthy. He called the letter unprecedented and undiplomatic. Bob, some are saying this letter by Republicans borders on treasonous. What do you think?
Well, let's talk about the letter first. It really has to be read to believed. These senators are educating, quote unquote, Iranian leaders about the U.S. constitutional system. It almost sounds like a kind of fraternity prank letter. It's really quite bizarre. Of course, it's appropriate for U.S. citizens to oppose policies they believe not to be in the interests of the U.S. public or the world. And communicating directly with other governments is perfectly appropriate for citizens. People I know have, for instance, done that, gone to foreign countries, tried to challenge U.S. foreign policy. But for sitting senators to engage in this kind of behavior, I'm not sure I would call it treasonous. It's certainly juvenile and inappropriate and unhelpful. But it does take this conflict into new realms. And it's another indication of how Obama simply drives these Republicans crazy and leads them to activity they would never accept in any other situation.
I mean, simply by virtue of him existing, they seem to get very upset. And finally, here in the United States, another unarmed black man has been killed by police, this time in Atlanta. The location of this latest incident is DeKalb County, Atlanta. The victim was 27-year-old Anthony Hill, an African-American man who was likely suffering from mental illness. He was naked and acting erratic when he was fatally shot on Monday afternoon by an unnamed white officer who used a gun instead of the taser he was also equipped with. DeKalb County police have said they are investigating the incident, and it comes just days after a white police officer in Madison, Wisconsin killed an African-American teen named Tony Robinson. Despite these incidents turning into a weekly or sometimes daily occurrence, we will continue to report them, even though it sounds like we're reporting the same story over and over. Bob, the man was naked. He couldn't have reached into his waistband, as we're always told happens just before people are shot. How do you think the cop would have handled the situation had Mr. Hill been white?
Well, we can't know in this specific situation, of course, but we can start to see the pattern. As you're pointing out, the pattern is now undeniable. The use of force, especially deadly force, in disproportionate ways against African Americans, this is now unquestioned. And in any given situation, people who want to deny this pattern look for, as you point out, the one thing that might have justified the shooting. In this case, there appears to be no justification whatsoever. We can see that this is no longer the kind of issue that can be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. We hope the Justice Department is going to be even more forceful than it's been to date. But of course, public protests, public demonstrations of an unwillingness to accept this are just as important. So if the government does go forward, that's all to the good, but it's only going to happen if people continue to say this pattern is now overtly, undeniably racist, and we cannot accept it.
Bob Jensen, always a pleasure to have you on. I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. After this short break, we will talk to a couple of guests about Selma and the civil rights movement 50 years after the march in Selma. And then, as part of our series on the politics of parenting, we'll discuss the princess problem. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network, Channel 9415, DirecTV, Channel 348, and on hundreds of part-time cable affiliates and on Roku. Tens of thousands of people gathered last weekend in Alabama, exactly 50 years after the Selma March. In March 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led hundreds of civil rights activists across the Edmund Pettus Bridge when they were brutally beaten by police on a day that came to be known as Bloody Sunday and that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. President Obama and many Democrats attended the commemorations. Obama gave a rousing speech on Saturday where he referenced the Justice Department's recent Ferguson report. Attorney General Eric Holder spoke on Sunday, warning of the real legal threats to the Voting Rights Act from conservatives. Republicans were conspicuously absent from the 50th anniversary commemorations of the Selma March. The events memorialized for a new generation of Americans in the moving feature film by Ava DuVernay, simply called Selma, shook the nation. And while a great many strides have been made, much progress has been undone in recent years. Joining me in studio today is Boyd Lewis. He's a photographer who documented much of the civil rights movement. He worked closely with black newspapers in Atlanta, Georgia, Martin Luther King Jr.'s hometown in the 70s and 80s. Kevin Alexander Gray is a longtime civil rights activist who also joins us. He co-edited the new book, Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence, along with Jeffrey St. Clair. His earlier books are The Decline of Black Politics, from Malcolm X to Barack Obama, and Waiting for Lightning to Strike, the fundamentals of black politics. He just spent several days in Selma for the 50th anniversary commemorations. Well, Boyd, let me start with you first. When you look back on that time, how important were the events of 50 years ago for the country as a whole? Did you think people realize at that time that history was seriously being made?
I don't think at the time. At the time, it was another in a series of brutal confrontations between the leadership of the civil rights movement in the South and local law enforcement, whose brutality cannot be underestimated. In fact, in Atlanta, Georgia, up until the 1950s, in order order to join the police force, you had to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan. I grew up in a very conservative, traditional Southern family in New Orleans, and I had relatives who had that attitude that the civil rights movement was a threat to everything that they held dear, and were willing to do anything to stop it. So I think when the first march, there were 3 marches in Selma. When the first march went across, and John Lewis had the fractured skull, and Hosea Williams, and a number of the rest of them were brutally beaten by the state patrol and a deputized police force. When that first happened, it was just another piece falling into place that the movement was not going to be easy to happen. And it was only about a week later when President Lyndon Johnson came out and strongly supported the passage of a Voting Rights Act and used the phrase, "we shall overcome." Shocking, and I remember that. It shocked everybody. It says, oh, goodness gracious, here is a white Southerner using a phrase that was constantly brought to white people's attention. We shall overcome. What in the world is going on in Washington? And then, of course, just 5 months later, we had the passage almost unanimously, Republicans and Democrats, of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
I want to turn to Kevin Alexander, who just spent several days in Selma. And Kevin, I'm wondering if you can express for our listeners what these last few days in Selma were like when you were there 50 years after the passage, less than 50 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, but 50 years after the major Selma march, where we saw police brutality on full display. This time around, instead of 600 people, there were tens of thousands, including yourself.
Well, I actually went down to Marion first, Alabama, where everything started. And it just so happens I've been back and forth to the Black Belt, I guess 3 or 4 times in the last month. I was over in Arkansas, and Alabama and Mississippi the week before the Selma 50 celebration. So and when I worked with Reverend Jackson in the 80s, it was my responsibility to organize that South. So just getting reoriented with Black Belt politics and Delta politics was really brought back memories for me. But then when you see the economic conditions that people are living under, that we're celebrating Selma. If you go to Marion, you'll see people in Marion celebrating Marion 50.
And actually, just for a moment, explain for our listeners what the significance of Marion is, because we don't hear as much about it as we do about Selma.
Well, it was so funny. I was in Marion, and some of the people said, I asked them about the movie Selma, and they would say, good movie, not true. And part of it was because they've been left out of the story. Marion is where Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed. And Reverend James Orange and Reverend C.T. Vivian were organizing. The SCLC had a contingent of activists down in the area doing voter registration. And when you go out to Marion and when you drive around Alabama and you drive around Mississippi and you see the ruralness of the area, the remoteness of the area, the flatness of the area, the swamps, the delta, you're reminded of the topography of terror, of people working out in the fields, sharecroppers who were under the thumb of white folk, regardless of their station in life. They could be the white fathers of the United Citizens Councils, or it could be the terror of the Ku Klux Klan. But when you're out there, you can feel how tough it must have been to be afraid, or to have to be ready to defend your life, because not everybody was afraid. There were some people that would shoot back and fight back. And part of what was going on in that organizing was fighting back. Jimmy Lee Jackson was a veteran. So he had gone off and fought, and he came back like my father was a veteran. They went off and fought in wars, and they came back to the South, and they were expecting their rights. They went off to fight for freedom in other countries, and when they came back to the South, they were expecting their rights and willing to fight and die for those rights. Right. So everything started in Marion, but you hear everything about Selma, and even someone said you would have thought when they were writing in the movie that it talked about trouble in a little town across the way. that what would have it taken a screenwriter to write the word Mary?
Well, let's actually take a listen to a short excerpt of a speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave in the days following the march in Selma, which was where he referred to the march. And this has been preserved in the Pacifica Radio Archives, which has generously shared this audio with us. This is Dr. King addressing reporters, or actually addressing a crowd of people and reporters 50 years ago about so-called Bloody Sunday.
We had here today the greatest demonstration for freedom, the greatest confrontation we've had in the South by the thousands, and if my eyes are serving me right, I would say around 4,000 of us were able to do something in Selma today that we've never been able to do before. Last night and this morning, as we grappled with the problems that we face here, we made a decision. First, we decided that we would have to march today, that we had a sort of divine imperative facing us, and that we had to go through with it, come what may. We decided that at least we had to move to the point where the brutality took place Sunday. We decided that we had to stand up and confront the state troopers who committed this police brutality. Yes, sir. Now, we also decided along with that, that in accord with our nonviolent spirit, the nonviolent movement, that we would not seek to break through a line of state troopers that assembled there, but we made it clear that we had to march.
And that's Dr. King addressing folks in the days following the march in Selma. Boyd Lewis, the work that Dr. King and hundreds and thousands of people did in the passage and pushing for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. People died for this. They were beaten for this. They risked their lives for this. And yet today we're seeing these hard-won battles, modest as they are in the protection of voters, being undone. How do you view this?
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court, I think, has set the tenor of the times. They repealed the enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act, and immediately the Old South, the states that rebelled against the United States and caused what we call the Civil War, they immediately started to roll back protections for voting and started to putting in a whole series of new restrictions on voting, joined by other states around the country. 26 states in all have decided to pull back on the right to vote. And we used to look at the Supreme Court as the arbiter of laws that help the people, but now we're seeing the U.S. Supreme Court rolling back those issues. In the previous program, Sojourner Truth, I think the guest made a very important point. We have to train a new series of long-distance runners in the movement for social justice in this country. And as long as we look at this Supreme Court as being the arbiter of all of our rights for now and for all, I think it's a very wrong position to take. It's going to be a long struggle, and it's going to involve white and black and Hispanic and all of Americans working together to say this is a society of justice. It has to be, and Dr. King has shown us the way, and now we have to cross our own set of bridges, and they might not be so easy to cross. There might be some more confrontations ahead. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, linking up with the Occupy movement, poses a powerful threat to the powers that be in this country. And if they can just get together and come up with a strategy for that long-distance pursuit of justice and freedom in this country, then I think we can look at the future with optimism. I
want to play an excerpt of President Obama's speech on Saturday in Selma and get Kevin Alexander Gray's response to that as well. This is an excerpt of a speech that President Obama gave, a very rousing speech that many say was one of his best.
If we want to honor the courage of those who marched that day, then all of us are called to possess their moral imagination. All of us will need to feel as they did the fierce urgency of now. All of us need to recognize as they did that change depends on our actions, on our attitudes, the things we teach our children. And if we make such an effort, no matter how hard it may sometimes seem, laws can be passed and consciences can be stirred and consensus can be built. With such an effort, we can make sure our criminal justice system serves all and not just some. Together, we can raise the level of mutual trust that policing is built on. The idea that police officers are members of the community they risk their lives to protect. And citizens in Ferguson and New York and Cleveland, they just want the same thing young people here marched for 50 years ago, the protection of the law.
And that is President Obama speaking on Saturday to a massive crowd gathered in Selma commemorating the 50th anniversary of the march in Selma. Kevin Alexander Gray, this particular speech, when I was listening to it at first, there was a lot of those same hope and change generalities. Then the president began talking about Ferguson and policing. How important was it to make those connections, you think? And what was your overall impression of his speech?
Oh, you're just going to put me over a barrel. Listen, I've heard a lot of speeches. You give a speech, you quote a Bible verse, you say some highfalutin words, and meanwhile, you kill people with drones, and you have an assassination program, and you're sitting next to George Bush, and you lead this charge, as we saw with the 50th anniversary on the March on Washington, that somehow or another government was there when people were crossing the bridge. Government was there, but it was trying to stop people from crossing the bridge. And then this idea of the police as your friends. Outside of a report, let's see what the Justice Department does across this country, because there are plenty of police departments in municipalities and states that live on the revenues of gouging poor people and keeping poor people under fear. So, personally, I just don't think the president has a whole lot of moral authority, especially when you have a drone program and you're killing people. And you've basically expanded the war on terror. And you're sitting there on the stage with somebody that came up with this idea of preemptive war. And so, it will take a whole lot for him to impress me.
Well, Kevin, what sort of connections were made among the people who gathered in Selma?
I was at the St. James and it was back and forth filming the documentary I was working on in Selma, and the documentary is called The Other Side of the Bridge, and so I spent a couple of days in that area driving around the neighborhoods outside of where they are building a civil rights infrastructure so that they can capitalize on the civil rights history of Alabama. And so, as I said, I have a different perspective of coming in and watching hotel rooms be 5 and 6 times higher than they are regularly, selling people back their history at a high price. But meanwhile, all around the area, there's still high unemployment. There's still the challenges of getting people educated. You drive around Selma, outside of the historic Selma, and it looks like nothing's really changed. And so people went across that bridge and they fought for Voting Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and they fought to increase people's capacity to participate in the system. But, there's still a whole lot more to be done. It's got to be more than about commemorations and having photo ops on a bridge and thinking, hey, that John Lewis was the only person that went across that bridge, because that's where a lot of the focus is. There are people like Diane Nash who refused to march across that bridge behind George Bush, who are still standing on principle and who are marching to demand things in the here and now. You're right. Black Lives Matter. Those young people should have been on that first line going across that bridge if we're going to commemorate anything, because it's young people that fuel movements. There was young people then back 50 years ago, and it's young people now on the front lines against all this police abuse or with Occupy on how the economic system is corrupt. Instead of commemorating the past, we need to put those kids on the front line. That's the best thing they could learn in all of this.
Boyd, what do you make of what Kevin is saying, that we're sort of selling our history back to us, and that, yes, it's easy for today's presidents to laud what was done, but what would the same government be doing if they were presented the exact same situation? And in fact, we see the test today. We see the armed killings of unarmed men by the police, and we don't see enough being done by the Obama administration and enough emphasis being put on the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement.
I think President Obama has always said that I will only move as far as I am pushed by you, the people. He doesn't come out of the classic African-American tradition of the United States. His father was, of course, Kenyan. His mother was white and from Kansas. And he was raised in Hawaii. And then he went to Occidental College here in Los Angeles. He did not come from the kind of Southern leadership tradition that would put a little edge on his anger, on his sense that things are not performing justly in the country. And so he really does need a constant pressure, not only from the Congressional Black Caucus, but from we the people. And I'm going to address my fellow white people out there. You have got to cross that line and start to make alliances and make common cause with the people who are constantly pressing for a more open society. Just because you're white doesn't mean you've got it. And I think in this economic climate, white people are realizing that they are just as much a pawn of unrestrained capitalism, red in tooth and claw, if you will, as any black person in the Alabama Black Belt. And so for us to transcend,
maybe.
For us to start transcending that and putting pressure on not only President Obama, but members of Congress, members of the media who define much of our agenda in this country, where we move and what we do. Well,
Boyd, I want to ask you to explain for our listeners, and our TV audience has been seeing some of your photographs of some of the years in Atlanta post-civil rights legislation. Tell us a little bit about the experience that you had documenting many figures in the civil rights movement and those years in Atlanta following the passage of the Civil Rights Act.
Right. Well, I came to Atlanta from Meridian, Mississippi in the summer of 1969. Dr. King had been assassinated 15 months before. But I wound up in the middle of the world that created and nourished Dr. King. Dr. King just didn't appear. He came from a long and distinguished civil rights tradition in Atlanta, starting with his father, Martin Luther King Sr., who'd been a civil rights leader in his day. And I started working for the most militant black newspaper in Atlanta, and I happened to have a camera. And so even though I was hired as a writer, freelancing in photography, I just went and took pictures of everything. And everything in Atlanta in the 1970s included historic elections that naturally followed on the civil rights movement. Atlanta was like ground zero for the American civil rights movement. Virtually every civil rights leader you can name came from Atlanta or went through Atlanta. And it was just a blessing for me to be immersed in that kind of atmosphere and to be able to take pictures and not be, hey, it was that white boy over there with the camera. What were you taking pictures for? The FBI? I said, no, I'm with the Atlanta Voice. And they said, oh, you working with J. Lowell Ware? Yes, sir. Okay, well, I guess you're the white boy with the black press. And the name stuck, and I just, sort of floated between the worlds of white and black Atlanta and was immensely blessed by that experience, because I think what it did was to scrub away some of the overt racism that I still had and that I still have. All white people have a little germ of racism. Sometimes that germ is real big, and sometimes that germ is just a little tiny. But we do have a position of privilege, and I think we owe it to everybody, especially the young. And as a former teacher, I say that, especially the young, to talk to the young people in a way that they can understand, which is boundless opportunity, but you always have to focus on what you want to do and where you want to go. And we as a society have lost that. Yeah. We're too entertained, I think, to do another mass civil rights movement, but the germs are there, and the impetus certainly is there.
Finally, Kevin Alexander Gray, you have written a number of books. You've co-edited Killing Trayvon's, a very important book, and you mentioned this documentary that you're working on right now, The Other Side of the Bridge. Tell us a little bit more about that and what you hope to achieve in the work that you're doing to continue to spark the activism that is so very much needed.
First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to listen to my brother. You know, I come from black newspapers as a black newspaper editor, and as I listened to him, I could just remember all those days at Pascal's in Atlanta. I started out with the SCLC and Reverend Abernathy. My first big march was a march of a racial Klan killing, we thought, in Chester, South Carolina, from Chester to Columbia, a 65-mile march with Reverend Ralph David Abernathy. And, you know, I just wanted to meet all the people and work with most all the people that I could that work with Dr. King. So, you know, all of this is, you know, and you learn when you're young. So what do I hope with killing Trayvon's? The issue is to try to build a movement. There are demonstrations and there are protests, that, as Diane Nash mentioned in her interview on Democracy Now! But movements are connected to something long-term. And we have to rebuild organizations. We have to rebuild networks. We have to build a movement that is not only viral, but is material, that where people go to meetings, where people press politicians, because we have to redirect or block a lot of things that have been erected over the last 20, 30 years that got us to this attack on the Voting Rights Act, attack on pre-clearance. We've had gerrymandered districts that make it almost impossible to have any kind of representative democracy. So there are all kinds of things that we have to go back and re-challenge. We have to rebuild a network. It's got to be led by young people, but it's got to involve all people. It's got to be multiracial. It's got to be multi-issue, and that's when movements take place, and that's when change takes place. And hopefully, at least with the Killing Trayvon's book, we can give people a history of the context of what it is that they're struggling with as it relates to police violence or official violence against people of color in this country.
Well, Kevin Alexander Gray, we'll have to have you back on when your documentary, The Other Side of the Bridge, is out. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us.
Thank you.
My guest, Kevin Alexander Gray, is a longtime civil rights activist. The book that he co-edited is entitled Killing Trayvon's, an anthology of American violence. He's also written the books The Decline of Black Politics, from Malcolm X to Barack Obama, and Waiting for Lightning to Strike, the Fundamentals of Black Politics. He just spent several days in Selma. And my guest, Boyd Lewis, some of whose photographs I'll hold up for our TV audience that he took of civil rights leaders. And I'll pass these to you, Boyd. Boyd Lewis is a photographer who worked with a number of Atlanta newspapers, black newspapers in Atlanta. These are gorgeous photos, so if you can see, our TV audience can see them right now. Boyd, thank you so much as well, and best of luck to you in your work. Thank you. This is Uprising. When we come back, we will turn to our ongoing series on the politics of parenting, this time taking a look at the so-called princess problem. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now subscribe for direct access to all our shows online at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Your subscription sustains the TV production of Uprising. Disney's upcoming live-action feature film Cinderella by Kenneth Branagh is supposedly to be a feminist retelling of an old fairy tale where the main character has agency and intelligence. But sadly, it is visually very much in line with unrealistic notions of feminine beauty that we see in the animated Disney films. Actress Lily James's waistline as Cinderella appears so tiny that many accuse the filmmakers of photoshopping inches away. But the actress revealed that it was indeed her waistline, stuffed into a corset so tight that she was forced to be on a liquid diet throughout filming. Little girls in contemporary American society are so immersed in so-called princess culture that today it's commonplace to see them dressed for school in princess costumes, wearing glittery and impractical shoes, worrying about their appearance, and refusing to own a single piece of clothing that isn't either pink or purple. What is princess culture doing to our daughters, and how can parents who are sickened by its effects fight back against the highly lucrative industry that promotes this deeply seductive culture? Today, as part of our ongoing series on the politics of parenting, we address the dangers of princess culture with Rebecca Haynes. She is the author of The Princess Problem, guiding our girls through the princess-obsessed years. Welcome to Uprising, Rebecca.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Sonali.
Well, it seems as though we have kind of always had princess culture, haven't we? Given that Disney cartoons featuring the passive, stereotypical female characters that have somewhat maybe evolved in recent years, they've been around for decades. Or is it just so widespread now that it just seems that there have always been girls obsessed with wanting to be princesses?
You know, it's really actually a marketing phenomenon that Disney tapped into about 15 years ago. They realized they had all of these princess properties that were individually very popular, and that when they re-released the movies into theaters or onto DVD or video, people would watch it and buy a whole new surge of products for that princess. But they realized about 15 years ago that if they brought all the princesses together into one unified line called Disney Princess, that the line would be worth more than the sum of its parts. And indeed it was. It's become one of the most successful licensed brands globally.
And so tell our listeners about how you got involved in investigating this notion that princess culture is widespread and that it might be harmful. I understand that for your book, The Princess Problem, you did very, let's just say, real research, first-person research. You actually dressed up as a princess and went to birthday parties.
I did. I'm a professor at Salem State University in Salem, Massachusetts, and my research area is girls' media culture. But I'm also, on the side, I am a singer and I enjoy performing. And one day I was backstage at a rehearsal for a performance, and one of my friends said to me, "You know, I've been making great money on the side as a birthday party princess." And the more I had her talk to me about it, the more fascinated I was, because when I had done the research for my previous book, Growing Up with Girl Power, in the early 2000s, little girls would talk to me about girl power, but princesses kept coming up, and I thought, you know, this is important, this is significant. So with the help of my friend, I networked and I got a job on the side as a birthday party princess. And so every weekend I was sent out as a princess to little girls' birthday parties. And so I was able to really, in a very first-hand way, see what the momentous occasions that girls enjoy celebrating princess culture were like in their lives, you know, for the good stuff and the maybe not so good stuff.
So let's talk about how prevalent it is today. I don't have daughters, but I see, you know, the girls in my son's school, and many of them show up in little princess dresses these days. I mean, it's almost, you know, it's nobody bats an eyelid anymore if you see a little girl dressed up as a princess wearing glittery shoes. But even regular clothing seems to have been infused by the virus of princessness with like everything being pink and glittery and flowery and curly cues and you know, pink or variations of pink and purple. Is this something that is so widespread now that we don't necessarily notice it unless we're really looking for it?
I think that's a great way to put it. You know, I interviewed dozens of parents for my book in addition to going undercover, and the consensus was that even among the parents who thought, Oh, yeah, princess stuff is overwhelming, and I'm going to hold off on that for my daughter. It is so ubiquitous as to be unavoidable. It's everywhere. It's not just the clothing and the toys. If you go to the grocery store, there are all kinds of grocery items from SpaghettiOs to grapes that are packaged with pictures of the Disney princesses on them. Even at the hardware store, there are Disney princess seeds in the garden center and Disney princess bedroom paints. It's literally in every product category. It's unbelievably successful, but therefore unavoidable. For little girls growing up in America today, it is like the air that they breathe. It's everywhere.
Okay, so what's wrong with this? I can, imagine some parents who haven't thought about this as a problem saying, so what? So what if our daughters go through this princess phase? They'll grow out of it. Or if they don't, so what?
Yeah, it's true. Girls will grow out of it. What is concerning to a lot of experts and, critics, including myself, is that princess culture does set girls on a pathway in which they become accustomed to receiving positive feedback about their appearance and thinking that how they look is most important. Think about it. When a little girl goes to the grocery store dressed in a princess dress that should be a Halloween costume, but she's wearing it year-round because she loves princesses so much, people stop and they comment and they say, oh, aren't you a pretty little princess? Aren't you so beautiful? It becomes a feedback loop where they get hooked on that external validation. And as they get older, if their parents haven't taken a few different steps to just sort of mitigate the effects, it really can become exacerbated as they're heading into adolescence. And the last thing you want is an adolescent daughter who's hooked on getting any kind of feedback possible for the way that she looks.
And we will talk in a few minutes about the kind of mitigation that parents can do. So there's the obvious gender issue, but what about the racial issue? Princesses on our screens are rarely non-white.
Disney for a long time had a series of white princess after white princess after white princess. And finally, when they created the Disney Princess brand, they looked back at all the princesses they'd had up to that point, and I think they realized that it was just Jasmine who was not white from the film Aladdin, and Pocahontas. What they did at that point is to make the line look a little more diverse than it was. They sort of tokenized Mulan, who is not a princess and does not marry a prince, and made her part of the Disney princess line. And then a few years ago, they created The Princess and the Frog, where they had Tiana, who's the first African-American princess. One of the challenges, however, with having sort of a bunch of white princesses and then one each of these different races or ethnicities is there's a burden of representation placed upon the one princess in that category. If you think about it, little white girls can look up to a whole range of white princesses who have a range of behaviors and appearances and values and beliefs. But if a little black girl is looking up to the first African-American princess, Tiana, one thing I've heard from a lot of parents is, she can't be all things to all people. And obviously, not every family of color, not every family that's black is the same. And so there's disagreement within various communities of different races and ethnicities as to what's good and bad about those representations. So some parents say, yes, Tiana, finally. Others say, hey, why is she cooking and cleaning the whole movie? Or why is she a frog for 2/3 of the film? This is not what we want our daughters to see. So it's so complicated.
And of course, the other aspect is the body issues that are raised among girls, not just their clothing and their outward appearance, facial appearance, but their body issues with the unbelievably unrealistic waistline sizes of these Disney princesses. So we can say, all right, in the cartoons, they exaggerate. Eyes are, the size of the eyes is half the face, so the size of the waistline is about the same size as someone's arm. Mm-hmm. But we have this new live-action feature film that I mentioned, Cinderella, coming out this Friday, where they have artificially reduced the waist size of the actress playing the part of Cinderella, literally by forcing her into a corset, which, was something that women would be forced into in the past century. Somehow Disney didn't think that it was inappropriate to do this to this actress and then to present this body to girls.
I was really
She
shocked.
couldn't even eat solid foods. Oh.
Yes, I saw the interviews with her, and I was shocked, and then I thought maybe I shouldn't have been shocked because this is just Disney. They're trying to make this woman who is already of a remarkably small body type, right? She's on the very small side, even smaller, so that she is as cartoonish as possible, and yet it's a live action film. Now, I know that some of it is also an optical illusion, right? The poofiness of the skirt. The skirt is so full that it makes the waist look even tinier. But frankly, if they're already getting that with an optical illusion, why cinch her waist so tight that she could only be on a liquid diet while she was filming? That just is more extreme than is necessary. Disney is aware that parents and critics have these concerns, and the responsible thing, honestly, would have been to say, you know what, let's let her natural waist, which is already plenty small, be evident in these scenes.
Right. Well, Rebecca, what are the ill effects on boys of princess culture? On the one hand, I imagine it teaches boys to judge girls based on their appearance as well, and see them as these passive creatures obsessed with their looks. And on the other hand, there's also this sense that it can be taboo for boys who might want to experience or experiment in so-called girly things for fear of appearing too effeminate. God forbid a boy might wear a tutu or a pink shirt, for that matter. I mean, even a pink shirt these days is a girl's outfit.
Oh, I had one parent tell me about little boys who wouldn't drink out of pink straws from the set of straws because the pink was a girl color.
Yeah, my son wouldn't wear purple shoes. I mean...
Oh. Yeah, I mean, what's happening is girls' culture, girls' interests are being marginalized and constricted into what I call monochromatic girlhood. If it's pink, it's for girls, and if it's not, it's for everybody else, meaning for boys. And what happens is they're dividing and conquering our children in the marketplace so that parents who have children of both sexes feel compelled to buy twice as many toys because things that were once gender neutral, like the radio wagon and the, the Mega Blocks and the stacking rings by Fisher-Price, they're all available now in pink versions and the regular versions, but clearly the regular versions are targeting boys. I actually published an article in the Boston Globe magazine last week about this, just charting how significant a change it is that currently we actually, as a culture, have gender segregated our children, in large part thanks to the rise of princess culture, more significantly than they were segregated in the 1950s when gender stereotypes were socially acceptable.
Wow. Well, Rebecca, let's talk about the backlash from parents of daughters and in pop culture, particularly online these days, seems to be pushing back, making fun of princess culture. I'm thinking of the wonderful staged photographs a few years ago of the real lives of Disney princesses that an artist created and put online. Someone else also took stills from Disney movies and thickened the waistlines of the princesses to more realistic sizes. Can you tell us about some of this backlash?
Yes, I think that the backlash we're seeing in social media in particular, like those thickened princesses, and I think the line you're talking about of photographs was fallen
princesses, yeah.
Right, which I thought was so brilliant, and all kinds of memes that are out there really are tapping into a groundswell of cultural concern where we're kind of at a tipping point nowadays. People are tired of all things princess being given to girls as really their only choice. And now we're seeing new companies that are independent rise up, like Princess Free Zone and Princess Awesome, that are creating shirts or dresses that break gender stereotypes for girls. And at the same time, we're seeing companies like Quirky Kids and Jack and Jill Kids that are creating unisex things for boys and girls, in some cases making pink items for boys to try to break down these gender stereotypes, very much like when President Obama was doing the Toys for Tots event and he was sorting the toys into girls and boys piles, and people were questioning his, placing baseball sets into the girls bin, and he literally said, "I'm just trying to break down these gender stereotypes."
And he's the father of 2 daughters, so he gets it. There's also Goldie Blocks, which has enjoyed enormous success.
Oh yes, they're another Kickstarter brand.
Rebecca? We're going to have to call Rebecca back. Her video stream has frozen, so do bear with us. And we are discussing her book, the book by my guest, Rebecca Haynes, who is a media studies professor at Salem State University. Her book is called The Princess Problem, Guiding Our Girls Through the Princess-Obsessed Years. And this is part of our ongoing series on the politics of parenting, which, by the way, you can find all of our other episodes in this series on our website at uprisingwithsonali.com. And we have a number of issues that we've tackled in this series over the last few years. And again, we're speaking with Rebecca Haynes, who we're trying to bring back onto video stream with us. In a few minutes, if you stay tuned, we will talk about how you as parents can combat princess culture. Rebecca, are you back with us?
I'm back.
Yes,
Thank you.
Goldie Blocks you were about to mention.
Yes, so one of the things that's terrific about Goldie Blocks is it was another independent Kickstarter brand in which a woman just said, you know what, if the mainstream building toys like Legos aren't really going to welcome girls into their major lines and continue to market themselves as boys' toys, we're going to give girls something that is just as good, where they can create and be inventive and feel good about the fact that they're girls and have it celebrated. Other independent companies have launched as well. Like there's a doll line called Lottie that the doll is modeled after the average proportions of a 9-year-old girl, so you don't get the body image issues that you get with these more mature doll figures. And there's a Snow Queen Lottie, there's a new astronomer Lottie, there's all kinds of Lottie dolls with a range of interests, but never a princess, which is really interesting that there is this much backlash that people are saying, you know, we're just not doing princess anymore.
It's been overdone, clearly. Well, Rebecca, what can parents of daughters do, and actually just parents in general do, when their children are sort of influenced overly by this princess culture? It's everywhere. I mean, you can certainly put your kids on a media diet by just saying, we're not going to watch these princess stories anymore, but you run the risk of your child hating you.
Yeah, and that doesn't really work. They'll see it somewhere else.
Exactly. And you know, it's really tough for parents of daughters to shop for clothes that aren't pink or purple. How do we combat princess culture?
Well, I think that one of the most important things any parent can do is to watch and discuss media with their children. And this goes for parents of boys and girls. If we as parents can sit down with our children as they are watching television and basically be their, what I call pop culture coaches, just coaching them through this pop culture environment that has good stuff and bad, we can point out to them, oh, I really like the part where she does X, Y, and Z, and reinforce our values for our children. But we can also say, oh, you know, I don't know about that part. I think that, you know, when the witch talks about Rapunzel getting chubby, that you shouldn't talk to girls that way. That's just not appropriate. And you can really point things out in concrete ways. And, you know, little kids, they're good. They're parent oriented. They want to listen. And it's the time to get to them when they're preschool, early elementary school, and are still parent oriented. And they'll accept our values and they'll be instilled in them throughout life.
So what you're saying is that rather than try to control everything our children watch, teach them to be mini media critics and teach them media literacy skills.
Indeed. I think that if there's something you are really concerned about that might be really bad for your child, you have every right as a parent to say, you know what, I'm going to say that this is crossing a line and this is not appropriate. And teaching kids what's age appropriate and what your concerns are helps them take no for an answer. But in general, if there's something that you know they're going to see anyway, like a Disney princess movie, you know, or other media texts, or you can do this in the toy store as well. You can look at the packages as you're walking down the aisle. Just letting kids watch TV and sit alongside them isn't enough. We have to talk back and make sure that they understand where we're coming from. The same is true with children's books. Studies have shown that when parents read their children books about things like racial diversity, if the parents don't actually, for white parents in particular, if the white parents don't take a moment to say, you know, I'm really glad this book has children with different skin tones because I think that's really important. Kids might not understand that parents are actually endorsing that positive content. So the talking with our kids is crucial.
And so finally, do you think that Disney, which isn't the only sort of perpetrator of princess culture, but certainly is the main and most lucrative money-making venture in the United States, is it taking note that there's this massive parental backlash of parents who want to see their children, their daughters grow up as empowered women who don't give in to who want to shun princess culture? Are they, do you think, slowly rethinking this entire approach to marketing?
Well,
or is that too optimistic?
You know, in the movies, in the content of the storylines of the film, you can see that the princesses themselves are behaving in more empowered and self-directed ways. But Walt Disney Studios is separate from Disney's consumer product division. And I think the biggest problem right now is actually with consumer products, because when they try to make princess products, they're never bringing out of the movie the empowered and interesting parts of the girls. You know, there's no Belle's library set. There's no Mulan in her armor, in her warrior gear. There's only the pretty, pretty version. They're reducing them all back to the mean of the earliest princesses like Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, that were really meek and passive and pretty. So I think that if Disney as a corporation could get consumer products division on the same page as Walt Disney Studios, which has made progress with great characters like Merida and the sisters in Frozen are a big improvement in behavior over previous princesses.
They still have teeny tiny waists, of course. But
the visual side of it is horrible. The visual side, I think, is only getting worse. I think it's getting more exaggerated. And that feeds into what's happening in the toys, because when you buy your child a toy that's modeled after one of these characters, it has all those exaggerated markings and none of the behaviors. Toys don't have behaviors embedded in them. So it's really a conundrum. I hope they'll get their act together. Parents really want to change.
And so of course, these companies usually respond where it hurts them, which is in the wallet. Rebecca, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. Certainly your book can be a great guidebook for parents of daughters. Thanks so much and best of luck to you.
Oh, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
My guest, Rebecca Haynes, is a media studies professor at Salem State University, and she is the author of The Princess Problem, Guiding Our Girls Through the Princess-Obsessed Years. This is part of our ongoing series on the politics of parenting. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia and Kiana Turner are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Golhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.